Hey everyone, this is a clip from a recent episode of the Men of Steel podcast where we talk about Superman and Superman adjacent topics. If you enjoy this clip, check out the podcast. You can find it at certainpov.com or wherever you get your shows. Yeah, so looking through this, even though like physics is super not a thing that I can like really work with that well, like just the equations are just an area where I'm like, no, can't do it. I did really appreciate reading through this all because it is, one, fascinating, and two, similar to some of my own headcanon. So I'm intrigued by this whole part. And I mean, do you want in your words to sort of like give a summary of like what the basic unified theory is, and then we can kind of talk like bit by bit?
Certainly. Okay, so the basic idea here is Superman has a variety of powers. Super strong, invulnerable, he can fly. In addition to that, he can shoot lasers out of his eyes. He can breathe cold on things. Yeah, that's a pretty good rundown, I think. Anyway, so
he also can do super ventriloquism and super knitting powers. He's demonstrated in the past.
Oh, he has super
speed. And when his gender was flipped, he had Superwomen's intuition.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
I have no physical explanation for Superwomen's intuition.
What about super ventriloquism? I feel like that actually fits.
No, yeah,
that one works actually fairly well here.
Easy peasy.
And the super muscle control of the Golden Age actually fits very well. You even cited.
So basically, instead of in terms of scientific approaches to Superman's powers, usually people bring up very heavy planet, Krypton, etc. And so he has super muscles because he is a different species, one that's much stronger. Anyway, so basically my hypothesis, I'm using passive voice just now. The hypothesis is that what Superman can do is, to a level almost impossible to fathom, he can change the inertial mass of an object by touching it. Down to the molecular level. But essentially what this means is when Superman picks up a building, he's not picking up a building that weighs several tons, he's picking up a building that weighs as much as a cardboard box. And when he is flying, he is lowering his own mass, and he gets buoyancy effects, and he can push off things and kick off things. His muscles do not weaken, but he's as strong as a regular person, but his capacity to change things' mass allows him to do all of these different things. And like I said with the equations, the mass parameter enters into a whole bunch of different equations when you're talking about heat. Heavy things interact with heat in a slightly different way than lightweight things, so if you change that mass, you'll end up spewing cold or making beams of cold heat come out of your eyes, or they affect vibration, and so he can tune his ears to hear higher or lower frequencies. And that's basically the gist of it. He's only got one power, and it's based on things he can touch.
Yeah, and like I said, that actually like kind of goes with a lot of the headcanon that like I have, and that I feel like a lot of writers, especially in like the 80s and 90s, really pushed, because there was like kind of a movement post-crisis to try to be like, how do his powers work? And it's interesting how this actually maps pretty well to sort of that era. I mean, particularly if you think about the death of Superman era, like the Triangle era for Superman comics, where they introduced Superboy as like Con-El, who had tactile telekinesis, and as an offshoot, like seeing that as an offshoot of Superman's powers, and then his clone Match actually had even more advanced versions of that was able to emulate some of the superpowers that Superboy lacked, like the heat vision that he could apparently
tactile telekinesis. Is that what you're referring to?
Tactile telekinesis, yes. But Match apparently could like do like laser vision by like accelerating photons and things like that. So it sort of is like consistent with this like larger idea of some sort of psychic thing going on, not just strong, heavy gravity, yada, yada, yada. And it's really interesting that the way you articulated it was by way of specifically inertia, as opposed to, I think a lot of people were just like, oh, it's psychic. You know?
I mean, the deal is that Superman doesn't affect his surroundings underfoot the way it should. The classic examples like he catches somebody who's fallen out of a plane. That person has a tremendous amount of downward momentum, and Superman getting in the way of the ground and catching them before the ground, that's fine, but he needs to take all that downward momentum and do something with it.
Otherwise, he's just the ground coming at them from a different direction.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
And force, for example, is the change in momentum divided by the amount of time that interaction takes. So, like Superman, he's Man of Steel. It's like when Lois Lane falls out of a plane into Superman's arms and doesn't hit the ground, unless Superman like bows his trajectory dramatically to increase the amount of time he's like catching her, it's like she's hitting two metal poles stuck on the side of a building, effectively. And so what we're conjecturing here is that Superman can touch Lois Lane and get rid of her momentum by driving down her mass instead of changing her velocity super fast.
And one thing that might be worth mentioning at this point is, people might be asking, why is Ryan back on the show? And the reason I'm back on the show is that Ben and I are buddies, and this paper had only recently been published in the early days of my own podcast, Science Sort of, and one of my friends had come across it and said, oh, this is hilarious, we should talk about it on the show. We have like two topics on my show. So we had our first topic, which was about something else, and then the second topic we were going to do Ben's paper. And I saw, as we were like literally starting our recording, I saw that Ben had put his old email address at the top of this paper, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so I literally shot him an email and said, hey, Ben, you don't know me, but I do a science podcast, and we were planning on talking about your paper. We're just on Skype. If you want to hop on, like, just send me a friend request. Here's my Skype ID. It was, 2009. I don't know if you remember, Ben. September 2009, I believe.
Yeah.
And it might have been October,
I think early
November.
October, yeah.
Yeah, the paper is dated September 30th, 2009. So.
Yeah, so and he responded right away saying, yeah, sure, sounds good. So I surprised my two fellow co-hosts with, like, when we got to that segment, I was like, okay, and now here to discuss the paper with us is the author, Ben Tippett, and that was like episode 9 of our show, and Ben has been on the show ever since because he's just a delightful person, and we've become good friends. And it's so funny that, like, he responded to that email immediately and was willing to hop on Skype with 3 complete strangers to talk about his paper.
Remember, if you like the clip after you're done liking and subscribing, check out certainpov.com, where you can find more episodes of the show as well as a ton of other great shows.